Hello, welcome everyone to OVA Hour number 3. I'm delighted to be here again with Lizellen La Follette. So we're here at the Buck Institute, and the Buck Institute is really a private, independent research institute wholly devoted to trying to understand what causes aging and how we might extend the healthy years of life. So we're here to talk about the reproductive longevity and equality initiatives at the Buck Institute. And I know that's a mouthful, but when I talk about, it is, right?
Yeah, it is.
When I talk about the reproductive longevity and equality issues, what I'm speaking about is really that as we're making progress in extending the healthy years of life, if we don't address reproductive longevity in females, then we're essentially going to be expanding and making worse gender inequality. And that's because menopause really does make a woman's body age faster. Independent of fertility, the negative health consequences of going through menopause are dramatic and really harrowing for women.
And I think it gives us an opportunity to finally look at the whole picture and say, what is the insight that we gain by looking at menopause? It gives us a window earlier, and now we can expand that question and investigations to be able to say, oh, guess what? This might actually make a difference for all of us and expand all of our health spans, which is really what we're all here for.
Exactly. So this webinar hour is one way that we're reaching out to you, to the community, to tell you about what we're doing here. I think Lizellen, I didn't properly introduce you.
Yes, well.
She's a global leader. She's a board certified OBGYN. She's an educator. She is a researcher. She's here in Marin, and she's really focused on comprehensive healthcare for women. So welcome, Lizellen.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back. I think it's hard to believe we're in episode 3. I think we'll have to have some good titles for these episodes. I have to say that if you look at what we're trying to do by basically understanding sort of the microcosm of the reproductive change, that we can then use that as an opportunity to really delve into lots of different processes that we learn with all sorts of aging for all of us. And better for us as a humanity to be able to have both men and women at the table from the conversations of aging.
Exactly. So last week we talked about menopause. We did a deep dive into women's health issues related to menopause and into hormone replacement therapy. This week we want to take a step back and talk about what happens to women before menopause and leading up to menopause. And so we're going to start at the beginning, the beginning of fertility, really, which is our periods.
Right. Well, one of the things that's so funny to talk at the beginning, but one of the things that you've said before, Jennifer, is when you are born, and I'm in the business of making sure people are born safely, you have as many eggs as you're going to ever have in your life. Well, that's a little tricky because you sure don't use it then. So fast forward to adolescence, and here we are. Let's talk about periods as the one thing that we know is going to happen to women as they age, and what are the insights that we can gain from that cycle?
Exactly. So most women, I think, understand that, periods on a superficial level involve, the buildup of the lining of the uterus, ovulation, and then if there's no implantation or pregnancy, then what we refer to as the period and the bleeding part. But I think a lot of times many women don't understand what's going on. Like, what do we even mean by cycle?
Right.
And we put a slide up here. We wanted to make a point, a really important point.
Right. So I think one of the most important things is that everybody seems to think that if their period is not 28 days, they are abnormal. And guess what? Very few of us have a 28-day cycle. And
12%.
Thank you very much. 12%, very few. So, and one of the funny things about that is if you think about it in general, is that if you're constantly trying to have a norm that isn't the norm, then all of a sudden you think you're off. So restart. There's a lot of fluctuation. We view fluctuation as normal between 24 days and 38 days, and that's considered normal. That's a big window.
It's a big window. Yeah, and this is really, this gets back to something that we talked about before, which is that fertility and women's reproductive biology is really one of the most complex signatures in all of human biology. It is complicated, and at the level of the individual, it's different. We're all different. And so this is something where, abnormal cycling, what does that mean when we talk about abnormally cycling? It's not about the length changing.
Right.
It's about a sudden change,
Yes.
where you go from a 24-day cycle to a 48-day cycle.
Exactly. But one of the things that's really interesting, if you go back to what are the developments of adolescence, one of the things that's so interesting is they'll give you, from the time you have your first period, they give you 2 years of basically don't count on anything. It's an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not until 2 years after your periods that we consider cycle variation to then be abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big window because everybody gets the period at a different time.
Right.
And that window is much, much larger. And there's a lot more leeway of cycle irregularity because many of those cycles are in fact not ovulatory.
Right. So here's an interesting question. And actually I want to stop and say, anyone who has a question, we are going to actually answer questions live at the end of this. And so if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box and we will try to get to it. If we don't get to it here, we will answer it remotely online afterwards. So this is an interesting point. So is the age at which a woman goes through puberty and starts their first period, is that related to the age that they go through menopause?
So we don't know. I mean, initially we always thought people that started early might actually end early.
Right.
But actually, I've seen the reverse.
Yep.
Some people are starting very early, 11, 12, and then they're going through menopause later than the average age is 51.
Right.
So there is no predictors. What is predictive, interestingly enough, is the mom's history. So if you think about, not only are we born with all of our eggs, but those eggs have the genetic material of our moms, our grandmothers, our fathers, our grandfathers. I mean, there's a whole lot of information there. And so there is some degree of similarity in terms of moms and daughters, but then the menopause can still be very different.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's definitely not known. And it seems like, the age, the reproductive span is really about cumulative exposure to estrogens and progesterones over a lifetime, combined with environmental exposures, right? And that's why it's so variable. So let's dive into the details. How does a woman's cycle relate to reproductive aging and menopause, right? And so when we talk about cycling, what we're talking about is hormones. And so, if you think about what's happening in a woman's body, we talk about these hormones. There's really three key components that make up a woman's cycle, and that is her ovaries, which we've been talking about a lot, her uterus, and the brain. So there's this three-way conversation that goes on between the brain and the ovaries and the uterus in both directions. And they're using chemicals to communicate. And so those chemicals are called hormones.
Right, exactly. And you might have actually started the other way around, the brain to the ovary message, because that's your research. So one of the things that's interesting from my side is we have been told in medicine that you get a period because a series of events happen. You have the development of puberty, you go through that, but there's some signals going from brain to ovary, and then the ovary is able to respond to those signals to then create an ovulatory cycle, or at least a cycle, some of which are not ovulatory, but at least that connection gets established. And other things influence it: environment, weight, exercise, all sorts of stuff that'll influence that trigger.
So here's what's keeping the cycle going, this conversation between the brain and the ovaries and the uterus. So this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but I think that every woman should understand this at some level. So at the bottom, we're looking at a cycle, which, we wrote 28 days, but as we started with, really, could be 24 days, could be 31 days. Caveat, but here's an entire cycle represented. And there's a lot of lines here. So each of the colored lines corresponds to a different hormone that's important for a female cycle. So in green, you have progesterone. So progesterone is really low for the first half of the cycle, right? And then it gets high during the second half. Estrogen, on the other hand, has a much more complicated pattern, and that's in orange red here. So estrogen goes up right until ovulation, and then it starts to go down and tanks during the ovulatory phase, and then it has a little increase.
Resurgence.
Resurgence. That's a good way to say it. And then there are two other hormones on here that maybe not everyone has heard of, but I think we will want to talk about. So tell us about those.
It gets into the brain message to the ovary. So how do we look at a cycle, and how do we measure whether there's a connection between the brain and the ovary? Well, one of them is in purple, follicular stimulating hormone. That's literally the brain message to the ovary. I want you to create a follicle. So follicular stimulating hormone is very important.
And so back up, what is a follicle? Just in case somebody.
So in the same way that red line increases, I want you to imagine that you have a little small egg that has now been, by about the 5th day of your cycle, then now become the big follicle that's going to be ovulated. It's interesting, there's a bunch of choice, because a lot, you were saying, I think before, that 1,000 eggs start to grow, but only one of them will be the dominant follicle. So during the estrogen red vamping line there, the follicles are following that same curve. And so they're developing, and now we have dominant follicle A, let's call her ova, is about ready to go, right? And the thing that's so interesting about that is, what happens to the 999 other guys?
Yeah,
right? I mean, gals, obviously. So, and I think we know what's interesting when you start to talk about egg freezing. You know that some of those may have been going to be a dominant follicle, and some may not. And yet, you cannot really influence how many are all going in one cycle.
Right. So that means that 1,000 eggs are lost every cycle once you start menstruating, which is something maybe not everyone understands. And birth control doesn't change that.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. So, okay. So we've got FSH, and then what's the blue line?
So luteinizing hormone. So follicular stimulating hormone is, okay, follicle, let's grow. Luteinizing hormone is, all right, what happens when that follicle is released? Okay, 2 things can happen. Nothing or sperm, right? Those are the 2.
Right.
So let's just assume that nothing happens for the purposes of this exercise.
Meaning that there's no embryo, there's no implantation, there's no pregnancy.
Well, and fertilization first, I would say, yes, and then from there, yeah. So anyway, so then the luteinizing hormone is then stimulated right after or with ovulation, and then it primes the uterine environment as if it were going to actually need to be primed, and it then pushes the progesterone out, and then all of them fall when there's no fertilization.
Okay, so again, you don't need to remember the details on this slide, but I think what you want to come away from this understanding is that this is complicated.
Yes.
And this repeats how many times in a woman's life?
Right. So yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
if you think about, if you have your periods from 12 to 13 until 50, and it's every month, and you're losing 1,000, that gets to be some pretty very advanced math.
And so, yeah, very, very advanced. And I will say the part of the brain, so I want to tie all of this together. So we're talking about periods, we're talking about cycling. What does cycling mean? How does that relate to aging and menopause and all of these things? That's what we're trying to pull together here for you. The part of the brain that controls reproductive function, that's controlling the cycling and talking to the ovaries and talking to the uterus, that part of the brain also controls energy balance and metabolism and body temperature regulation and sleep. Now suddenly, oh, wait.
Yes, exactly.
So thinking about things that happen during perimenopause and menopause, it's all related to this conversation between the brain and the rest of the body. And you're right, I'm biased.
Right, you're biased. and we should be hearing even more from the brain, and certainly Jennifer's brains from this particular idea. One of the things that's so interesting for me is, if you think about how important this whole cycle is in terms of, regulation and making sure that we're able to are we too hot at night? Are we too cold at night? Are we, are there other hormonal mechanisms in other parts of the brain that are interacting? Thyroid and some of the other things that are really interesting. So from my perspective, all of these connections in terms of metabolic stuff as well as hormonal stuff makes a huge difference in terms of how these cycles happen.
Right. So let's see.
So one of the things that's so interesting about it, if you want to think about it from a normal cycle that was so complicated, right? So if you think about it in terms of trying to understand this complicated cycle, anything that influences all 3 of those particular systems are potentially disruptive. So number 1, what happens to the brain, from the brain to the ovary message, right? So is there going to be other disruptions by other things that are happening? If you're not sleeping, we know that the biochemistry of the brain changes, your connection is different in terms of your cognitive function questions, right? Some of these things we talk about as we age. The other has to do with what happens physically to the ovaries, and how does the ovary uterine connection happen, and how is that all can be disrupted on its own, and it can be disrupted also in terms of coming from the brain message. So there's so many different ways in which this whole system can be impacted that we're trying to give you. This is what we think of as sort of a normal cycle. A normal cycle can, as we said, from 24 days to 38. But then what happens when it's not normal?
Right. So let's pick up on that. And I wanted to take a minute just to come back to the early initiatives of the book. So, we have a center here where we funded scientists to work on reproductive aging. And at the same time, we're doing just this amazing global outreach. We're trying to build up this field because what's missing is basic research, the answers to some really fundamental questions, like what makes a good egg? What is that cue or biological timer that causes a woman's ovaries to start to age so reproducibly during her third decade, right?
Right, exactly.
And then beyond that, we want to talk about some of the grantees that we've
Yes,
funded.
please.
So,
Yes.
Related to what we're talking about here, this brain rest of the body connection. Holly Ingram at UCSF is doing some fantastic work on estrogen responsive centers in the brain. Polina Lishko at UC Berkeley is working on how steroid hormones like progesterone and estrogen affect reproductive aging. Here at the Buck, Olfat Malak is working on how the peripheral nervous system actually innervates the ovary to try to imagine how the chemical conversation is happening. But let's move on. So what happens in an abnormal
But I
cycle?
want to, before you leave that, one of the things that you're trying to create in terms of a scientific community is that if you think about how few researchers have been looking at the reproductive cycle as an entity, if you have one in every prominent university, how are they connecting to each other? I mean, that's what we are, right? We are the tie-in internationally to be able to say, I know you're looking at something that we feel is hugely important, but let us all connect together so we can advance and learn from it, as opposed to just being the one scientist that happens to be doing reproduction.
Exactly. We're trying to build an ecosystem. Right? Yeah. And that means not just scientists, but also clinicians, people in biotech, really anyone in the world who has an interest in this area. All right. So hopefully you understand now what the normal cycle is. What about what happens in some of the sort of the less normal cases?
So if you think about, so we went through sort of puberty and menses. Now that we have all sorts of things that could go wrong, right? So the first one we talk about, and people have heard quite a bit about, is polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now,
PCOS.
So polycystic ovarian syndrome. The title itself tells you there are multiple cysts in the ovary. By the way, there are some of those cysts that will become a dominant follicle and some of them will not, but they happen to actually line the edge of the ovary, and it makes it look like they have a bunch of pearls around the edge of the ovary.
So if we take the picture on the left, this is a cartoon drawing of the entire reproductive system. On the left is what it would look like in a normal ovary. And so there's a lot of words here, but what's important to see is that, during the cycle, as you said, the primordial oocyte develops up into a mature follicle that eventually becomes ovulated, right?
Yes.
And so that's happening every single month. And so what's happening on the right in the polycystic ovary?
So one of the things, and we don't quite understand exactly how this happens, but one of the things that happens, as you can see, is the immature follicles start to just line up at the edge of the ovary without an ability to be released. So you have sort of multiple follicles, the ovaries get bigger, and that are sort of stuck, and I call it stuck in third gear, in that they're just ready to go, just like horses lining up at the gates to be released, but they don't get released.
Okay. So that's why it's called polycystic, because there's many cysts.
That's right.
Okay, so is this a pathology, or is this something that's a little bit more like just stuck in third gear?
Well, the reason why I think about it is third gear is because the development, so if you think brain goes to the ovary, the follicles are recruited, they don't stack up the way that wonderful drawing is to get to ova.
Right, they kind of stop.
They stop
they
before
stall.
ova, right?
Yeah.
So they don't get to the basically mature follicle. And then what's the trigger? And there's many to get them to then ovulate, right? So that's why I think of it as in third gear, because everything else is going fine. It's just the release part, the last part of the cycle that is stuck.
Okay, so if we're thinking about, patients that you see, for example, what are the kinds of symptoms?
So I think this.
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, you know what? Before we talk about that,
yes.
let's put PCOS in the context of the hormones that we just talked about for cycling.
Good.
So on the left, this is a much more simplified diagram where we're just looking at FSH and LH. And now, why did I put those on this slide?
So I think, what I think is so terrific is that the ovaries are pink, obviously, with their little follicles. And then you can see how they've all lined up on the PCOS one. So it's a really nice diagram. The other has to do with this idea of the trigger. So you can see at day 14, again, there's a range here. This is not completely set in
stone. The middle of the cycle.
In the middle of the cycle. To be able to trigger to get the mature follicle, in this case, the little blue egg, to be released. So in PCOS, there is not only is there a stagnation of the cycling, but often you see a higher LH than an FSH ratio. So when you actually measure somebody's hormones who are basically do not ovulate or don't have regular cycles, you'll see what we call the inversion of the LH FSH. Normally FSH at the beginning of the cycle is higher, LH is lower, but in this case, LH is higher.
Right. So yeah, if you compare the beginning here, LH is higher on the right in the PCOS cycle, and they're basically not cycling, and that's really what's leading to this what you see.
Right. And if you think about polycystic ovarian syndrome, just on the medical definition, all right, the medical definition is initially irregular menstrual cycles. Well, that's a little tricky because we've all talked about how only 12% of people have 28-day cycles. So that's a big catch-all. So number one, it's irregular menstrual cycles, but then it's a few other things. It's actually extra hair. So hirsutism is seen. Weight gain, so being heavier, is also seen.
Okay.
And then acne that comes with it. All of these being sort of physical manifestation, phenotypical manifestations of a higher testosterone, mostly because estrogen isn't cycling with progesterone, and then you have this potential testosterone.
Right. People might think testosterone is just something that men have, but
Right.
women do
We
have
do,
low
yes,
levels
absolutely.
of testosterone, and
That's
it's very important for
Right.
our cycles.
Right.
So in terms of symptoms, we've got a slide up here. Is there anything else that?
So it's interesting. So if somebody comes into my office and says, my daughter doesn't have regular cycles, what's going on? There are about
irregular cycles.
irregular
is something that's really
exactly.
important.
So remember though, we got a 2-year window in there from the time they start to cycle until we actually consider it to be something we have to investigate, right?
Got it.
So they come in, they're 17 or 18 years old, they're about junior in high school, and the kid says, I don't know when I'm going to get my period. It maybe has happened 3 times junior year. So usually I'll go back to the school year and say, okay, how many times that year? How many times this year? So then you get a pattern, right? Now, luckily, with these new apps in terms of Clue and Flow and these wonderful apps that'll track the cycles, most of them will come in and say, look,
something happening.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and then we start to do the investigation. But what are the things that we need to look at? What are the hormones we need to measure? And this is, I think, gets into some of the information about modern fertility that really allowed women at home to be able to ask the questions about how is their hormonal environment and get that information without necessarily having to go through medical professionals.
Got it. So tell me then, let's see, so you're mostly diagnosing this in teenagers?
Yes, typically I am. So there's 2 parts of this, right? There's the beginning insight in terms of their reproductive life, right? So teenagers, and most of the time they're not trying to get pregnant.
Right.
So then fast forward into when they are trying to get pregnant.
Okay.
And now we have to remember, hang on, what happened in here? So it's really important that although we can fix some of the problems in a teenager in terms of masking the issue.
And how do you do that? So what would you do if you had a patient who came in?
Right.
what would you tell a teenager? What's the standard of care for someone who has PCOS?
So if you think about that diagram in which we are not releasing an egg, right? So one of the things that's really important is that can we give you the fake trigger as if you were releasing an egg? So
Okay.
add progesterone, right? Add progesterone. Now, you'd think, why does that work? You didn't get a follicle. Why is adding progesterone? Well, you are exogenously from the outside adding progesterone, and then guess what? Stop the progesterone, you might actually get a cycle. And then you might cycle more regularly. You might not, but you might.
Okay.
So that's the first way. Add the piece that's missing,
Okay.
right? So progesterone is another. The other one is to say, okay, I know why. We've done some investigation. We've done some hormones. I know why you're not getting regular ovulatory cycles, but you really don't want regular ovulatory cycles right now.
Because you're a teenager and you're probably not trying to get pregnant.
And your parents really don't want you. So as such, we put you on a birth control pill, right?
Okay.
So we basically cover the issue.
I see.
So my conversation with the teenager is, I'm going to investigate the question. Our treatment may in fact cover it up. Your skin will get better, your hair will get better, your weight will likely get better. Some of that stuff will, some of that stuff won't, but for the most part. But it doesn't mean 10 years from now, we're not going to be asking this question.
Right.
And that we need to understand what we're doing because it didn't go away.
Right. Well, and because when 10 or 20 years later, when they might want to actually use their reproductive system for something, then they're still not going to be cycling regularly and they will not be ovulating. And then that leads to fertility issues later on. So when you have someone who's in her 20s or 30s who comes to you and you diagnose PCOS, what do you then tell those patients?
All right. So then now we get to tricky stuff, right? So first of all, the definition of polycystic ovarian syndrome, which has to do with these, hirsutism, overweight, infertility, there are a small subset, probably in the 20 to 30 range, that do not have these. They just don't cycle.
Right. There's there's a spectrum of symptoms, right? So from very mild to pretty dramatic. And many women, I think, don't even realize that they have PCOS until they try to get pregnant and they're having fertility issues. Then they get diagnosed.
That's right. So a typical 29-year-old who came into my office about 2 years ago said, look, I'm not really getting any cycles. I'm not heavy. I don't have extra hair. My skin is good. And then we did the hormones and we measured LH and FSH, but also we measured anti-Mullerian hormone.
Right.
So we haven't talked about that as a marker, but it's looking at what's happening to your eggs and in the question of the reproductive potential. And in her case, her anti-Mullerian was 30. I mean, I've never seen it.
That's really high.
Which is really high, which
really
basically
high.
means this is the third gear stuck again, right?
Right.
So you really want it to be much closer to sort of single digits, and this was very high. So I knew that if fertility was going to be the jump, then it was going to be really tricky because once you have all those follicles ready to go, and you know that you can, with hormones, stimulate them to release, you have a very high chance of releasing them all together.
Oh, and what happens when you release them all together?
Yeah, then it becomes ovarian hyperstimulation, all this other stuff. It's really like, weight gain and kidneys can shut down. It's a big deal. So when women come in and ask me the question, so I'm the first pass. It's like, I want to be pregnant. I've decided this is the thing I want to do. One of the issues is understanding the question and then what's the way to help it and making sure they're in the right hands.
Right. And so then what kind of advice do you give to women who have PCOS, who are trying to get pregnant?
So I think that they have to be under the care of people that have good comfort of this, that under the care of people that know that ovarian hyperstimulation can happen and we need to be careful about it, and recognize that this doesn't mean that just because they have PCOS at that point, once we get them to cycle, sometimes they break out of it and they cycle again. So that's the other.
And what about the connection to metabolic function? Coming back to this conversation between the brain and the ovaries and uterus, what happens, what kind of advice do you give them around lifestyle and is there a connection there?
Yes. So the thing that's so hard about polycystic ovarian syndrome with the the symptomatology that you see there is that weight is related to metabolic function, right? So this idea that blood sugar influences your ability to ovulate. So in some ways, that's a lovely thing because it means we have other ways to fix it, but it really is something in which a metformin, one of the medicines that will actually lower blood sugar, will actually allow some of these women to ovulate.
So metformin is something I think about in terms of diabetes.
For diabetes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like they haven't made it all the way to diabetes, but they're in that trend.
Got it.
They have extra estrogen, they have extra hair, they have extra weight, which is more estrogen also. Fat is more estrogen.
Right.
So if you can approach it metabolically, completely different approach, right? You have the infertility people, you have the metabolic people. You may get to the same result. You may get to a cycle that's much more regular and therefore can conceive without stimulating it, right? And then you're looking at it from the other side. So this idea that the reproductive changes and irregularities gives us insight into all of these other disease processes that we know about, but we haven't necessarily.
We have no idea, right? I mean, what you're talking about, what you've said, and this is the standard of care. I mean, you are invested in your patients, and you are giving them the absolute best that medicine has to offer, right?
Right. Well,
and
I try to do my best.
And we just don't know what causes PCOS. We don't know how to solve it. We know how to put band-aids on it, but we don't know how to solve it. And so these are the kinds of things that we're trying to work on here, right? We have grantees.
Yes, tell me about this.
Zita Santos and Carlos Ribeiro at the Champalimau in Portugal are working on exactly this question. They're looking at the relationship between metabolic function and ovarian aging, and sugar in particular,
Nice.
right?
Good,
Yeah,
good.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Okay, so let's see. We want to talk about some other stuff related to before we get to menopause.
Yes.
So what is this thing we're calling perimenopause?
Right. So that's a pretty nice catch-all, which is basically sort of you're done trying to have kids, or at least you can't easily conceive. So let's say 40s ballpark, and you have not gone through menopause yet.
Right.
Namely, menopause is defined as a year without a period.
A year without a period.
So here we go.
And if we back up to connect this to the beginning, menopause is defined by running out of eggs, right?
Yes.
So you run out of eggs, that's what triggers menopause. And when you get to a point where you have a very few eggs, then we put this slide up here looking at estrogen levels over time. You can see the period that's labeled perimenopause. Looks like a roller coaster.
Yes, exactly.
That does not look like fun.
No. Well, let's just say that there are all sorts of challenges of inability to predict. How do you like that?
Yeah.
So that's, putting us in a nice morass of just not knowing exactly how you're going to be feeling. And is it a good cycle? Is it a bad cycle? Is your mood changing? Is your weight changing? Is your sleep changing? Big things.
Yeah. So tell me, what are the symptoms of perimenopause?
So basically the unpredictability of the cycle related to probably, well, you know this better than I do on the basic science. Clearly, ovulation issues are probably what's happening.
Well, there's so many things happening, right? So you're running out of eggs, but also with age, the quality of the eggs declines, right? So by the time you're in your 20s, something like a quarter of a woman's eggs have issues with, genomic instability and aneuploidy and things like that. And that only gets worse when you get into your 30s. I'm just kind of fixated on this graph. So that range is up to 15, 16 years this can be going on?
Yes. Well, usually I think it's so interesting because as women, as we try to help women conceive into their early 40s, right? And certainly I'm seeing a lot of patients like that. This period may shrink, but the instability of the cycle in terms of predicting what's going to happen in the constellation of other symptoms, sleep deprivation, mood.
What are those symptoms?
Those can be night sweats, they can be irritability, they can be really sort of a hyper awareness of being sort of cranky after you ovulate, really not knowing why you're acting the way you're acting. I remember the kids were going through high school and I was pretty cranky through some of this. And I remember thinking, well, I should be. I have 2 teenage daughters in high school. that's enough. Well, you add this to it, it's really a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it really did look like a roller coaster, those
Right.
estrogen levels.
Right.
Okay, so there's a lot of symptoms of perimenopause. What do you do to treat them, or what do you tell patients who come to you who are in this stage of their life?
So before you assume this is all related to the menstrual cycle, you eliminate some of the other ones, right?
Mhm.
So the metabolic question,
Right.
right? What's happening to your blood sugar? What's happening to your thyroid?
Mhm.
What's happening sort of the brain endocrine axis?
Okay.
Check it. And then you get into, okay, what does this look like? And I always tell people it looks like you're not necessarily going to know what it's going to look like. So
Mhm.
you have to be a little more flexible in terms of how things are. Many women have night sweats here,
Uh-huh.
and they're thinking this is menopause. I'm like, no, you actually have more night sweats in perimenopause than you do in menopause.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes. So when
Okay.
somebody comes to me and says, why am I sweating? And my husband's in the covers and I'm out of the covers because I'm so hot. The answer is there are the changes of estrogen, that roller coasters that you see are probably every delta down is probably why you get in that.
I see. Interesting. Okay, so we don't know what causes perimenopause
No.
necessarily. We don't know what's causing menopause, except that you're running out of eggs. We don't know what that trigger is, though, the thing that causes us to start to age in our ovaries. What are the, are there anything on the horizon that looks rosy? Let's give them some happy news.
Yes, exactly. So for many people, if you think about all these wonderful scientists you're looking at, and we talk about sort of the problems with being an adolescent and trying not to get pregnant and then wanting to be pregnant,
Mhm.
and now maybe not being able to. If you think about it, there will eventually get some stability in terms of recognizing that, guess what? I have a soon to be cycle that is going to be a little less heavy, it'll be shorter, and I may soon be in a situation in which I don't have to worry that I might get pregnant. So I think there's some positive things about change here. But what I try to tell people is control a lot of the other environments,
Mhm.
right? So if your hormones are changing, pay attention to alcohol, pay attention to sugar,
Mhm.
pay attention to exercise. Do things that'll try to make it as regular as
As
possible
stable as possible. Yeah.
and basically decreasing the external
Mhm.
environment that's going to change some of these.
Okay. All right. Well, that's something.
Yes.
And of course, we are actively working on trying to understand what causes ovarian aging here.
Right.
And in terms of, therapeutics, things that are on the horizon, do you have anything that
I think
people should know about?
Well, most people talk about perimenopause also having a lot of bleeding. So I
Yeah.
always tell people there's always two reasons why you bleed. Either it's a hormonal reason or a mechanical reason. Mechanical being polyps or fibroids or maybe even a cancer. But so once you've eliminated the mechanical reasons, then it's probably hormone. Well, that's why you use the IUD. That's why there are these devices that actually can get rid of the sheddable lining and you don't get periods or these heavy periods, and that helps. So there's lots of things we can do if bleeding is the end manifestation of this change, and then behavioral things that'll really make a difference.
Right. But all of it's just a Band-Aid.
Yes, well, fair enough. Fair enough, as we're getting, yes, well, that's why we're here.
Yeah, exactly. And you were telling me earlier that you encourage your patients to communicate with you, right?
Yes.
So when you're going to your doctor, what's happening in an individual's body
Right.
is so different from the next person that keeping track of what's happening and telling your physician
Right.
what's actually happening, what's going on with you, makes a huge difference because, those cycles, we need to monitor them, pretty closely
Yes.
to understand what's happening at the individual level. And unfortunately, we don't have great biomarkers yet. We don't have great diagnostics to figure out where along my reproductive span I am even. And so that's part of what we're trying to do is to develop novel biomarkers, novel diagnostics, therapeutics, and potentially, make that discovery, figure out what's causing it so we can get rid of it.
Well, I mean, I think one of the best things that have happened in terms of technology is to have women have these apps that track the cycle.
Yes, and collecting data on themselves.
Right.
Yes.
So this idea of this symbiotic relationship in which the data you collected for yourself, but you contributed to the greater good in terms of women in general. And it's one of the ways we've learned that whatever the textbook told us it's actually not that, and there's something different. And how do we know? Because real women have had the courage to say, yes, it's fine that I'm tracking this, and yes, you can potentially use my data with permission, etc., to be able to make that happen.
Yeah, and there's so many companies now that are not just tracking, but actually doing telemedicine for women in perimenopause and menopause. Evernow is one that comes to mind, and the data they're collecting is so valuable to us scientists.
Because
so
we learn.
Part of what we're trying to do here with the reproductive longevity and equality initiatives is to make those connections between the companies that are collecting the data on real people and the scientists who are doing the work, so that we can get to this faster. The goal is to get something in women's hands quickly.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the best lines that we were taught in medical school was 50% of what we've taught you is wrong. We just don't know which 50%.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about what OVA is doing and what this whole consortium of reproductive equality is doing, is it is allowing all of us to connect so that we then become an enormous amount of information to actually refute what we think we know.
Right.
So one of the best things about OVA, and one of the things that I want everyone to know that's been on these webinars, is we are about educating you, but we want to hear back from you also. That involves, subscribing, making sure that you understand that this particular initiative is for all of us to learn, and that you can give to us as well as we give back to you, to make a huge difference in terms of advancing the information, and therefore, and the community of men and women who are committed to learning about these topics.
Right. So in addition to the webinars, we're going to have a library of articles and papers. We're putting together some resources for people. And yeah, it's something that I think we really want to connect with the community. We want to bring you information. We want you to be dialed into what's happening. And we want you to be able to come, when you can, in person and visit us.
So now, finally,
see what the scientists are doing, right? Yeah. And yeah, beyond that, I think we're really excited about this. So we want to take questions.
So I just want to just highlight this particular slide about principal investigators and labs and research.
Okay.
Researchers are in my mind, the most important person to change the questions. The problem is you can't do it one at a time. It takes too long. So if you think about CRLE and OVA as literally a knowledge base that advances us all, because there are more than one of us going together to learn, we will all advance the ball faster to work together. One of the best things that came out of COVID was all of the work together on the vaccines, right? I mean, that was everybody. It didn't matter where you were, we worked together. Let us do the same for women's reproduction, because it really feeds back into human reproduction, which gives us an insight on terms of health.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so we've got Q&A here, and I am just gonna bring up the questions. So let's see. What percentage of women have PCOS? That's actually a really great question.
Yes, it's actually 12-15%. I think that it becomes a catch-all in terms of what's defined as PCOS, but cycle irregularity with some hormonal changes could be probably as much as 20%. But as PCOS, as we define it with obesity, hirsutism, et cetera, it's probably 12 to 15, maybe less.
Okay, and then let's see, has there been an evolution over generations of the onset and the patterns in menarche and menopause? Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, recently, right? So there's been huge changes in the age of onset of menarche, and it keeps getting earlier and earlier. And then same thing with menopause. So we just had, for the first time, the average age of menopause moved by a year.
Yes.
Which is great,
which is
but
really
1 year, that's not enough.
No.
Not enough.
No.
Can you speak about the relationship between menstruation, menopause, and different brain functioning for adolescents and the elderly? Wow, that's a big question. Let's unpack that.
Yes.
Sorry, I can't see the question anymore. So the relationship between menstruation and different brain functions. So one thing to understand about the brain and the way it talks to the rest of the body, this chemical communication, is that the brain will use the same hormones to set up puberty during adolescence, and then use them in a different way during adulthood, and then even in a different way during menopause. And so it's really about the cycling, the levels, and the way they're communicating. So there's actually several parts to the hormonal signaling system, right? So there's the hormone itself, like estrogen, but then how does the tissue that it's signaling to know? So the tissue that it's signaling to, so the ovaries, for example, will have a receptor, so something that can sense the estrogen. Or in the other direction of the brain. And so it's when the hormone binds to the receptor on the target cells that you get this kind of signaling response. And so all of those components can change. Who the receptors are, where they get expressed in what cells, where the hormone is, when it's released. So all of these things, it's incredibly complex. But turns out the human body is an amazing machine, and so the brain can use these things differently at different time points in the life.
And I think one of the questions that I was also asking is the cognitive function. In other words, how do we feel? How sharp are our brains at different times of our menstrual cycle, right? Yeah. And so I think that is a very interesting thing, really, if you think about this whole mechanism, it started brain to ovary, right? So why wouldn't you think that there's a connection that you could tell a difference in terms of those, right?
Well, certainly, right. We know that, I said that menopause makes a woman's body age faster. Menopause dramatically increases the risk for cognitive decline, right? And so the absence of estrogen and progesterone and that cycling that we were talking about really does impact a woman's ability to think.
Exactly. The fuzzy brain.
The fuzzy brain. Well, it gets it. Yeah, exactly. As someone who has been diagnosed with a mild form of PCOS, many years her symptoms were masked with birth control, and she struggled with fertility in her 30s. And she's just thanking us.
Yes.
So long. Thank you.
Yes, but remember, part of this is an opening of a window for information. So information from us to you, information from you to us, and allow us all have an opportunity to answer some of the questions and maybe ask more.
Yeah. Here's a very specific question. How common is breast swelling and pain during perimenopause? And is there anything that can be done to minimize it?
Well, if you think about hormonal shifts, you're going to this gets into where are the receptors for estrogen and progesterone. They're in the breast, they're in the brain, they're in the gut, they're all over. Typically, breast tenderness, right, typically before the cycle, is related to the hormonal changes, but it can be treated often with vitamin E. It really is a dietary thing. You should be very careful about sugar and alcohol.
What about salt? Is it so? The swelling, is it actually just fluid retention in specific places, or is it more than
It's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of both. I don't quite understand it clearly, but it clearly has an important hormonal influence.
Here's a question about endometriosis. So we didn't cover endometriosis today, but we might on a future webinar. Is that related to estrogen imbalance?
So the autoimmune factor, so here we are, we're getting into the next topic. The autoimmune factor of endometriosis is clearly something that needs to be better explored. It does affect fertility in that endometriosis decreases year compared to year your fertility. It's an interesting thing. The eggs do not respond to stimuli the same. They don't fertilize the same. So to me, that is an immune problem.
Yeah, right, exactly. And we haven't even touched on that yet. So again, this is something we could do a deep dive into. Dorothea asks if we're going to do a discussion on endometriosis, and we absolutely will. What else can cause infertility when the cycle is working well? This is a great question because we touched on this before, that fertility itself is cyclical, and that even young women can go through periods of infertility. Older women can go through periods of extreme fertility, and at the level of the individual, it's stochastic. And there's so many things that go into influencing those cycles and that sort of level of fertility. So what are some of those things?
So I think that one of the things that we are using as sort of a blunt tool is using the menstrual cycle to ask about what's happening to the egg. And that's a little bit sort of like hammer and nail. It's not very sophisticated.
I mean, most of the
Right?
tools we have are not sophisticated,
Okay,
right?
but
Taking your temperature, come on.
right. All right. But if you think about it, you're asking a question here about an event that happened 12 to 14 days before the onset of the menses, right? And so now, does it mean, what information do we get? The only information we know is between the time you ovulate and the time you get your period is always 12 to 14 days.
Right.
That's about it. Now, what more do we know about, are you ovulatory? Are you not? I mean, we would have to go through the hormonal changes at each cycle, and each cycle is different, which, only makes it even more complicated.
But what are some of the things that can influence, I'm not at a stochastic level, but what are some of the things that can influence, a woman's potential to ovulate? Are there like environmental factors or things that, we all impact our own physiology by not sleeping,
yes, exactly,
by not getting exercise, by eating French fries?
Yeah, that is right. So diet is clearly one, environmental exposure, radiation, right? Toxins in terms of, what kind of foods are you eating? Metabolic stuff related to sugars, obviously. And I happen to think in general is like you want to sort of prime your best self. You have to watch your weight, you have to watch your exercise, you have to watch your sleep. So some of these basic functions clearly make a difference. How much of a difference? I think it depends on how much you're willing to invest in it, but I think they actually can influence
a huge difference, right? And this is true for aging in general and extending healthy longevity. Everyone wants a pill they can take that's just going to keep them healthy. But the truth is that the easiest and some of the best remedies are things like diet and exercise, which nobody wants to hear.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Well, I think we've gotten into a whole world in which the quick fix has to happen.
Right.
And there's nothing quick about this. Sorry about it, but we have to all put in the time.
Yeah. Let's see. What non-reproductive organs have estrogen receptors?
Nice.
That's a great question. And can we step back and just say that there's two kinds of estrogen receptors. There's estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta.
Yes.
There's actually a third one as well, but it's not actually called estrogen receptor. But so where are they expressed?
So this is your basic science. This is you. Okay. She's really looking at me.
Everywhere.
She's going to answer the question.
Well, the truth is they're everywhere. You can find them in almost every tissue. And when their expression changes. So it's not static. None of this is static. At different times in a cycle or at different times in a person's lifespan, they're expressed in different places.
Wow,
and, one of the things that we talked about with hormone replacement therapy is that it's important when you start it. And that is because if you don't start it early, then what happens is there's this absence of estrogen, right? Absence for a period of time after menopause. And when there's no hormone around, the receptors get downgraded, right? So if there's no hormone stimulating them, they get taken down. And so if you then add back hormones for hormone replacement therapy many years after menopause has kicked in, there's no receptors there for the hormone to act on. And so it's not going to have the same beneficial effects that it would if you had started right at the beginning.
Right. Really important. Exactly. You need to try to keep the ones that you have and stimulate the ones that are still there. Sure.
Yeah, really true. Let's see.
Oh, so this is a great question about Elizabeth Blackwell. So I'll brag a little bit. My youngest daughter's thesis was on Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first women physicians in the country. And one of the things that was so interesting about it is this question about stress and telomeres. So there's actually been a book called, actually I think it is about telomeres, so the effect of your telomeres, terrific book in which it basically talks about how stress changes the little ends of your chromosomes, right? And so the idea that the worst circumstance is taking care of an ill child, right? Your telomeres get shortened because you as the provider and as the parent are trying to take care of the child, and your telomeres.
That's a lot of stress.
It's a lot of stress. So clearly there is lots of environmental impacts and also physiologic impacts that can change what happens to the end of our DNA and how do we want to keep it as long as possible. So it's really important.
Yeah, stress is definitely something that influences that part of the brain that controls reproductive function too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's all just tied up there in the hypothalamus.
Right, exactly. But I think it's a very interesting thing about when people come to me and they say, well, how can I decrease stress? Okay, I don't know, but you tell me, because I mean, there's about 4 ways that you can try, and most of the time you'll be stressed because you're stressed, and so then you're trying to not stress. So outlets, from my perspective, that are healthy. Go for a walk, read a book, turn off the screens.
Get some exercise.
Right, get some exercise. Do that again,
Endorphins
repeat.
Endorphins.
Right?
Yeah.
Meet with friends.
There are a few questions in chat. If we have a few minutes, I can read them for you.
I think,
Sure.
I can read them from chat.
Sure.
Okay. What are the most fertile areas of research regarding the relationship between women's reproduction and aging?
Oh, I see. What's happening now? Well,
yes. Did
yeah.
you talk to about the people that are being supported by Harley?
Well, I mean, I could talk about this for hours.
Yes.
So, and I have to be clear. The Buck and the Arlie initiatives have really, it's really exploded in the last few years. Research in this area, and I'm very proud of our work.
Yes.
So, there's work going on around questions related to egg quality. What is it that makes a good egg? That's something that's so fundamental that we don't know the answer to. And when we think about, all the women who are freezing their eggs, thinking that they've somehow made an insurance policy for later in their lives around fertility, and then coming to that terrible knowledge years later that in fact no, we don't know how to freeze a good egg.
Right.
We don't
Egg
know
is
what
the
it makes.
largest cell in the body. It doesn't freeze well. Guess what,
Yeah,
guys?
eggs are tricky.
Yeah.
But beyond that, the interplay between the environment and women's reproductive aging is a really hot question that Francesca Duncan's lab is working
Yes,
on.
that's right. Good.
Trying to understand not just how exogenous environment influences reproductive aging, but also how the microenvironment in the ovary changes with age and how that can change, the quality of the egg, the numbers of the eggs, how things are working. That's like incredibly important and so exciting. There's a lot of research that's going into now trying to understand, like we were talking about earlier, what's happening in the brain and what's happening in these reproductive circuits that are, that are controlling what's happening in the ovaries and the uterus. Things that there's a lot of research going into what happens like inside the egg, like what's happening at the level of the DNA, right?
Nice.
So thinking about, again, what makes a good egg. What else? Gosh, I could talk about this for
Well,
days.
exactly. I was going to say, is there anyone we haven't talked about that's gotten support from
Oh gosh,
Harley?
there's
Come
so
on.
many
Let's
people
talk
that we
about.
haven't talked
All right.
about.
Well,
Let's see. Thinking about how the oocyte is such a strange. It's like magic if you think about it. It is the largest cell in the body, but it's also it's quiescent. So all of the oocytes are made during development, so in utero, and then they have to be quiet for decades until they're actually needed. And so they're quiet, not doing anything, and then suddenly they're recruited, right? To be ovulated.
Right.
And once that happens, when they're recruited, they have to just jump into action. They have to get going again, turn on the metabolic programs, turn everything on so that then they can be made competent to be fertilized, right?
Sure.
And so what that means, and the reason they're so big, is because they're storing all this RNA. So,
This is great on the basic science. I
DNA,
love this.
RNA to protein.
This is our next
right?
topic. Yes.
And protein is kind of, those are the workhorses. RNA is the intermediary. DNA, we all know what DNA is. But so, eggs store all this RNA, and then going from RNA to protein so that they can be ready, that we call that translation.
Oh, interesting.
And, there's a lot of work going into trying to understand what happens to those stored RNAs, over time. Similarly, what happens to those stored energy powerhouses called mitochondria over time, and how are they changing, and how does that how does that influence egg quality and reproductive aging? Those questions are so incredibly important. Marco Conti at UCSF is working on that. It's just what he's doing is incredible. All right. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of the hour, so we're going to wrap up. But if there are questions that are left in the chat or in the Q&A box, we will answer them and post those answers online. I wanted to thank you, Lizellen, for joining me again.
Great
it's always
pleasure.
fun to talk to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we will. This particular series will continue with you and all sorts of very fancy and very smart scientists in terms of looking at the next aspects.
Right. So I wanted to encourage everyone to join us again next month. So it looks like the slide got a little bit skewed, but on August 5th, we're going to have our 4th OVA Hour webinar, and I will have Daisy Robinson joining me. So Daisy is a PhD scientist. She is a lifestyle guru. She is also someone who is in the middle of starting a really beautiful biotech company around female reproductive aging.
Nice.
And so we're going to talk to her about women's health. We're going to talk to her about research into reproductive aging and what's happening in terms of, having women in science and women being studied by scientists.
Okay, nice, exactly, finally, yes.
But please join us for that. And thank you again for tuning in. And I guess we'll see you next time.
Exactly.